Hello and welcome back to the afternoon session if you're on the East Coast, NTA Spectrum Symposium. We're going to have another great lineup of speakers and discussions for the second half, beginning with what I think is going to be a very informative and important keynote address. So I think you'll be glad that you've tuned in once again as we get started with our program. Congress sets the nation's agenda through legislation, and that is certainly true in the spectrum policy field to much great effect. Legislation such as the Mobile Now Act and the Spectrum Pipeline Act have strongly boosted our nation's economic growth, national security, and well-being. We are very proud and grateful to welcome our first speaker for the afternoon, Representative Mike Doyle, Pennsylvania, Chairman of the House Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. Chairman Doyle's subcommittee, along with the parent House and Energy Commerce Committee, are the primary spectrum policymakers in our country. Representative Doyle is deeply familiar with issues driving the national debate about how to allocate and use our spectrum resources most efficiently and effectively. We are honored that he's accepted our invitation to speak, and we look forward to hearing his insights on how Congress is preparing the U.S. to face our ongoing 21st century challenges. Here is Congressman Doyle's message.
Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. And thank you to Secretary Raimondo and Acting Administrative Romali for their leadership, and to the Associate Administrative Cooper for his kind words. The issue being discussed today are critical for continued U.S. leadership in wireless technologies, so I'm pleased to be able to participate in this event. Whether it's the importance of mid-band spectrum, how new and incumbent users can share spectrum more effectively, or planning for future uses of spectrum, the dialogue you are facilitating today is essential. I'd like to also acknowledge the other crucial task you all are hard at work on, namely, getting all of our communities connected. Through our work over the last few years, Congress has handed some big, important responsibilities to NTIA, including Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, and hopefully soon the State Broadband Grant Program that would be established by the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's before the House. It's hard to overstate the importance of these responsibilities because broadband connectivity is no longer a luxury, it's an essential service. It is unacceptable that our students have to sit in parking lots and fast food restaurants or outside the library to connect to Wi-Fi. It's unacceptable that patients lack reliable upload speeds to talk to their healthcare providers. And it's unacceptable that we have millions of Americans who still struggle to pay for broadband service. I'm hopeful that Congress can conclude these efforts soon and finally put America on the path to 100% connectivity. That will take a government-wide effort and collaboration with states, community-based organizations, and service providers. NTIA's work to facilitate both wired and wireless solutions will be critical going forward. I'm glad to see the broad range of voices NTIA has brought together today. Spectrum management decisions, sharing, and reallocation are not always easy processes. I commend all of you for your contributions to these discussions. It is this challenging, complicated work that will lead to better outcomes for all spectrum users. As important as spectrum is to broadband connectivity, I'm not sure I've ever received a letter from a constituent about spectrum. This isn't something the average American is contacting Congress about. But these issues and policies will have a significant impact on the public nevertheless. People are heavily dependent on their mobile phones today and upset when they lose service or their ability to connect to an in-home device or TVs or to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And there are many other uses that consumers never even pause to wonder about how they work, like garage door openers, baby monitors, and health trackers, for example. Or how wireless and spectrum-enabled technologies fuel businesses, bringing products to them faster and more efficiently. And that doesn't even include all of the indirect spectrum benefits policies foster. We all have benefited from the rise of the app economy, whether it's as a consumer, employee, or entrepreneur. Frankly, the average American shouldn't have to think about the policies that facilitate our connected lives. So, I don't lament the lack of constituent mail on this. Rather, I believe it's a sign of good policy making and good spectrum management processes that have enabled these innovations to take place seamlessly and responsibly. It's also a testament to NTIA's adept role as manager of federal spectrum and its work with stakeholders to ensure the most efficient use of the nation's airwaves. As chairman of Communications and Technology Subcommittee, I hope to continue our collaboration in identifying spectrum bands that could be more productively used and working with other partners in the federal government and the private sector to get the most of our spectrum resources. We've seen over the last few years the rise in focus on mid-band spectrum and its unique ability to facilitate fast speeds and wide coverage. But these are not greenfield bands. It's hard to balance our priorities here, whether that be clearing bands for high-powered use, dynamic spectrum sharing, or protecting existing operations. We must all continue to push for the most efficient use of these bands because they have the potential to do so much more for consumers, the economy, and our country. As you are all aware, we recently considered and passed in the Energy and Commerce Committee concerning the 3.1 to 3.45 band. This is an important band for consumers and one that has real potential to not just bring new wireless broadband capacity online, but also the potential to foster new innovative uses for consumers, businesses, cities, and universities. I think it's essential that portions of this band be made available for commercial use, and I've been glad to see broad bipartisan support for such efforts. As we work to reallocate mid-band spectrum, it's imperative that we do so through the long-standing policy processes that have proven successful in the past. Making a single spectrum stakeholder an incumbent user the final arbiter of reallocation decisions will almost certainly not lead to better outcomes for this country. There's no question that the operations of existing federal spectrum users are important and necessary, and that those operations must be protected. But when we are balancing multiple public policy goals, no single stakeholder should have the final say over the reallocation process. That's why my colleagues and I thought it was so important to reemphasize the time-tested role of NTIA in coordination with the FCC and the White House in working together to make these decisions in an equitable fashion. When properly utilized, the existing processes have produced excellent results for the federal government and innovation in our nation. And it is through this process that we have also seen hundreds of billions of dollars returned to taxpayers. I'm confident that with the input of all the stakeholders, we can find a path forward that both makes as much spectrum as possible available for public use, while also ensuring that important federal operations are protected. And we can do it in a way that will bring more money to the Treasury. Looking ahead, I believe it would be worthwhile to provide additional guidance and oversight from Congress on these issues. We aren't making more spectrum, and as much as consumers are using more data and demanding more spectrum to provide that capacity, so too are our federal agencies. We should be empowering them as their missions change to adapt to more users within the bands where they operate. There are questions worth considering as we move forward. How can the Spectrum Reallocation Fund be improved to allow agencies more flexibility in accessing its resources? And does the Memorandum of Understanding between the FCC and NTIA need to be reviewed and updated? While not exhaustive, these ideas are worth examining. It isn't ideal to have agencies coming directly to Congress or to the FCC to make their cases, outside of the traditional processes of having NTIA be their voice. How can we make certain that their input is fully considered at the beginning of these reallocation processes to ensure that the government is striking the right balance between these equities? Just as we don't want a single incumbent to have the final say over reallocation decisions, we also don't want the quest for the next big thing to supersede the ongoing missions of other spectrum users. Affected agencies should be at the table early and often, and we should all recommit to a process that encourages that. Finally, we need to continue looking into the future for what other bands can be utilized by consumers and the private sector. The exponential growth in data is going to continue, and we should be making decisions that lay the groundwork for the next transformative technologies. As Congress examines these issues and considers legislation, your input is invaluable and welcome. So in closing, I want to thank you all again for your contributions to this effort and commend NTIA for hosting today's Spectrum Policy Symposium. The topics you're discussing will likely never be something I get asked about at a town hall or in a constituent correspondence, but each and every one of my constituents will in some way benefit from the decisions made by you and your colleagues. My hope is that through continued good collaborative work, we can connect even more Americans so that our teachers and students, patients and doctors, and workers and entrepreneurs can continue to thrive and prosper in the 21st century economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Doyle, for your comments, which come at a key time in our economic recovery from this pandemic, and as we work to fully leverage our Spectrum resources for internet access that is available to everyone. We will continue to work with Congress as we fulfill our existing statutory mandates, and of course, we stand ready to provide whatever information Congress needs in order to chart our future course. Now it is a time in our program when we give the stage to researchers, theorists, and engineers. This morning, we heard industry and federal government leaders offer their thoughts on what policymakers should examine as we develop new spectrum strategies, policies, and programs to meet our nation's full spectrum challenges and opportunities. This afternoon's discussion will focus on some of the specific technologies and tools being developed to further our nation's use of spectrum. These afternoon sessions will include presentations and a panel discussion previewing the 2022 ISART conference. They will be led by Eric Nelson, Rebecca Dorch, and Mike Cotton of NTI's research laboratory, the Institute of Telecommunication Sciences. Our first speaker is Rebecca Dorch, Senior Policy Analyst at NTIA's research group. She will provide a preview of the ISART 2022 conference. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Charles. So our goal for ISART 22 is to chart a roadmap and gain consensus for ways to use data, science, technology to evolve and hopefully expedite the spectrum sharing analysis and decision making. And ISART will include discussing options for a more dynamic and iterative process that takes advantage of ground truth data from real life spectrum sharing, takes advantage of updates in modeling and advances in radio and software technologies. To aid the ISART discussions, we will be posting a call for conference papers on the ISART website to obtain additional ideas and feedback on what I'm presenting today. But first, a little background on the International Symposium on Advanced Radio Technologies. ISART is a U.S. government-sponsored conference. It's hosted by the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences in Boulder, Colorado, since 1998. One of the hallmarks of ISART is the forum that it provides for discussions about science and engineering among government, industry, and academic leaders. ISART's also recognized for forecasting the development and application of advanced radio technologies, useful insights for the regulators that attend ISART. A decade ago, ITS held 3 consecutive conferences in 2010, 2011, and 2012, where the spectrum stakeholder community gathered in Boulder to discuss technologies and science-based ways to achieve the spectrum sharing goalposts that had been set out by the Obama administration in 2010 to make 500 megahertz of spectrum available by 2020. So the focus of the ISART program in 2011, that middle program of those 3 years, was to demystify radar technologies and understand radar's use of the spectrum. And that symposium actually helped provide some of the technical foundations for developing the regulatory paradigm for radar and commercial sharing in the 3.5 gigahertz band, which of course became ultimately the CBRS. So our goal for ISART 2022 is to be as impactful as that, to help build upon the lessons learned of the past decade and looking forward to evolving how we use data, technology, and science for spectrum sharing. So thanks to the efforts undertaken in response to the 2020 FCC broadband plan, the NTIA 10-year plan, and the 2012 report from the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, as was mentioned in both panels earlier this morning, and of course the commitment of the entire stakeholder community, together we have collectively enabled the U.S. to far exceed that 500 megahertz goal, achieving repurposing of over 7,500 megahertz of spectrum, with over 1,100 of those megahertz being that critical mid-band spectrum. And as we heard from the panelists this morning, also even more spectrum is being considered for repurposing. So the process used by the FCC and NTIA to make those thousands of megahertz of spectrum available for sharing is very broadly generalized in the graphic on this slide. First, bands are prioritized, then feasibility studies and analysis are performed. Next, the rulemakings are conducted. And then for spectrum to be licensed, auctions are held, licenses issued, equipment is certified, and commercial sector then deploys new services. At this point, we're usually done with the regulatory process unless there are legal challenges and enforcement issues. So with this tremendous success that we've experienced in the last decade, we've had lessons learned that we can certainly apply to improve the process for the next bands for sharing. Other factors have also arisen, however, over the past decade that suggest, as we've heard in the morning panels, that this process really could be reformulated. And we're thinking that it could be reformulated into an iterative and potentially more flexible process, which might also enable us to apply lessons learned to the bands that we've already set the sharing rules for. So the list on this slide, it just provides a few of the lessons learned and the factors that are prompting our suggestion to evolve to a more iterative process. Some of the potential solutions that were mentioned in prior panels are listed here also, but let me highlight just a couple of the engineering focus challenge listed. Feasibility studies first. Feasibility studies, as we've heard previously on the morning panels, they're based on incomplete technical parameters for new commercial systems, based on assumptions about new commercial deployment densities and technical information on existing federal systems. And then the rulemakings for the services then rely on those feasibility studies. And once the commercial service rules are adopted, they're static, which, potentially impacting the ability of federal incumbent systems to evolve their use of the spectrum. The second one, another lesson learned is engineering studies on federal systems are actually needed before the sharing parameters are set. It seems obvious, but critical engineering studies are too often done late in the process, after the parameters are set and only after the transition and relocation funds are available. Too often, we've seen late-stage identification of potential obstacles not accounted for, often related to out-of-band emissions and inadequate receiver filtering. And we're also looking at this as a process that could facilitate both earlier and repeated engineering studies that could build trust and stability. But granted, the current process is intended to foster market and regulatory stability. And the commercial interests who've paid billions during the auctions for these well-defined spectrum rights and lengthy licenses, that's really important. But the process, as we heard this morning, also provides little opportunity for optimization of sharing parameters. So ISART 2020 is going to look at options to evolve this process. The diagram on this slide is a very simplistic, generalized model for a continuous iterative process. The inner regulatory circle includes those key components of the current linear process, but within a iterative, responsive, and evolving context. The key differences here that we've identified are we've moved the auctions and certifications into the rulemaking process, and then we added a reassessment phase based upon real-world ground truth data, and which could also include any real-life information on any interference instances that are experienced. Then the outer circle represents an evolution of commercial systems with likely touch points for ongoing cross-sector dialogue to inform the regulatory process. The idea behind a sort of circular iterative model is to extend the regulatory horizon beyond that first set of regulatory rules to enable the process to be more responsive to technical evolution and to be more reliant on applied engineering analysis. Revisiting assumptions included in that initial feasibility study after early stage implementation and deployment of a new technology might trigger reassessment of aspects of the rules. Once new commercial systems have begun to scale up and expanded their deployments, Analyzing data from those efforts might result in yet another warranted tweak to the rules. Structuring a process that can evolve continually, even to stages of full market maturity and full system deployment, could also then enable ecosystems to be studied, the models and the interference protection criteria to be validated, and encourage lessons learned to be applied in other new sharing scenarios. Allow me to use an example from the first of the lessons learned I mentioned. And NTIA has been really transparent about this. The interference analysis, determinations of interference protection criteria, and predictions of sharing feasibility that determine if a federal ban is potentially appropriate for sharing, they're based on simulations, calculations, algorithms, and modeling that often rely on incomplete data. This leads to conservative technical and deployment density assumptions, and therefore to feasibility analyses that are not as accurate as they could be and are unlikely to achieve the degree of spectrum efficiency that we all desire or expect from spectrum sharing. If more detailed technical information were available initially about prospective commercial systems transmitter characteristics, including their antenna height, antenna type, power, and receiver characteristics and filtering of both new and potentially impacted systems, then parameters for sharing could potentially be less restrictive, and areas for protection and coordination could potentially be decreased. Now, we also realize that the technical details needed for these more precise and accurate feasibility studies are often proprietary and competitively sensitive, especially when you're working with new technologies to deploy in newly available bands. So why not reassess the sharing parameters when more accurate and realistic and ground truth data actually exists? And why not consider evolving the process to utilize new data as it becomes available to improve the efficiency of spectrum sharing, enhance opportunities for optimization without introducing unnecessary instability in the market? These are some of the questions that we're going to be asking at ISART 2022 to see if a consensus can be developed on ways to incentivize that increased sharing of technical data at the initial feasibility stage, ways to design a more iterative approach that considers newly available data after new commercial systems are deployed, and that allows for analysis of the difference between the assumed versus the actual technical parameters, a reassessment of the interference analysis and protection criteria, and then new studies to look at the feasibility of modifying the sharing parameters to enhance spectrum efficiency, and then a process that can adapt and adjust to changes in spectrum demand and mission requirements. To assist in planning for the late spring, next slide, thank you. To assist in planning the late ISART 22 conference and to ensure that we consider ideas and solutions and research from the stakeholders, we're going to be posting a call for conference papers soon on the ISART website. We've identified 6 research areas of interest that focus on using science, data, and technology and engineering to help evolve spectrum sharing. Accepted abstracts and papers will be included in an NTIA special report following the ISART conference. Authors will be invited to participate in a poster session and may be invited to present at ISART, which we're actually hoping to get scheduled for about 6 to 7 months from now. And we do hope that we'll be able to meet in person in Boulder next year rather than virtually. We'll see. The first topic, rather naturally, is a retrospective analysis and lessons learned about the spectrum sharing over the last decade. And would any of the bands currently shared be good candidates for testing an iterative reassessment model? Of course, we expect to be out of the quiet period for the 3.45 gigahertz band by next spring. The second research area focuses on technical analysis for predicting and preventing interference and identifying what data is most impactful. For instance, or for example, what technical characteristics of a transmitter is most determinative of its interference protection criteria? And what information about a victim receiver is most critical for determining frequency domain rejection? And then looking ahead, could planned engineering to promote coexistence be made part of the industry technology standardization process? The third topic is data sharing and transparency, which I focused on here today. The fourth topic focuses on models, particularly propagation models, which my colleague Mike Cotton is going to be discussing after the next panel. The fifth topic is interference, including quantifying harmful interference and moving from interference criteria that's based on worst case analysis to interference criteria that are risk-based. So from a scientific and engineering perspective, are risk-based assessments trustworthy for critical defense, public safety, weather forecasting, and scientific passive sensing missions? Can better scientific and engineering understanding of risk-based interference help to establish metrics for spectrum efficiency? Finally, and most importantly, or not most importantly, but importantly, can an iterative model contribute to ex post improvements to spectrum management enforcement and to better interference prevention and avoidance? So the call for papers explores each of these topics in a bit more detail. And notwithstanding how complex and interconnected all of these issues are, we encourage succinct abstracts and conference papers. So thank you. I hope you will enjoy, or you will join ISART 22 and engage in discussions to help us chart that roadmap based on engineering and data to evolve the spectrum sharing for the next decade. Now back to you, Charles Cooper. Thank you.
We look forward to the 2022 ISAR conference. And now on to our third panel discussion, which will be moderated and guided by my colleague, Eric Nelson, the Acting Director of ITS. Eric's panel will provide perspectives on some of the challenging technical issues we need to tackle in order to improve spectrum sharing processes. So here you go, Eric.
Thank you, Charles. So the International Symposium on Advanced Radio Technologies, ISART 2022, will bring together spectrum experts from policymaking, economics, and engineering disciplines to push the envelope on questions concerning radio wave propagation, waveforms, and other fundamental aspects of effective spectrum usage. The aim of this prequel is twofold. First, we've assembled a panel of experts from government, industry, and academia to discuss how engineering studies can improve spectrum sharing policies. We hope this is a compelling topic that'll draw you to the conference. Second, are you an expert eager to share your research and perspective? If so, please consider responding to the forthcoming call to papers that'll be posted on our website. Let me introduce the panel. We have my colleague Ed Drusella with NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management, John Hunter from T-Mobile, Nick Lanneman from the Wireless Institute at the University of Notre Dame, Lene McGrath with the DoD CIO Spectrum Policy and Programs Directorate, and finally Sam McMullen from Federated Wireless. Before we begin, another reminder is in order. You've heard this before, I'll repeat it. I can't be too careful. The FCC's rule on prohibited communications is currently in effect for the upcoming auction of licenses in the 3.45 to 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band, or auction 110. To ensure the competitiveness of the auction process, the Commission's rules prohibit auction applicants from communicating with each other about bids, bidding strategies, or settlements. Auction applicants who are participating in this symposium are reminded of their obligations under these FCC rules. So let's begin with a number of questions drawn from topics in our call for papers. Later, we'll also consider questions from the audience. To start off, one of the goals of ISART 2022 will be to explore mechanisms to make spectrum sharing technical decision-making better and faster. We propose an iterative approach that is responsive to ground truth data, especially as new systems and software are deployed. So the question is, would a rapid response, iterative, continuous improvement model akin to a plan, do, check, act cycle work for enhancing spectrum sharing? Clearly, we can always apply lessons learned from earlier rulemakings to future ones. But can we also adapt rules for new bands while they are being built out, or the systems are being built out? What are the key considerations in that case? And I was thinking, John, maybe you could start off with your background as a network operator. How would we go about that?
Well, I think first you'd look at the technology capabilities that are underway by a number of companies. First and foremost, the one that comes to mind is the work that Qualcomm is doing in the lower 37 gigahertz band, where you're allowing technology to really formulate how you can, impose a more equitable sharing framework. And they're doing it what they call a look before talk type of scenario. Yes, that's lower 37 gigahertz. The propagation characteristics are much less than what you would get in mid-band or low band. But I think you couple that with beamforming, the MIMO capability, all of that, along with the technology, it's somewhat akin to DFS, what you would have in the Wi-Fi bands. But I think allowing the technology aspects to really work for all parties, that's how you get to a more equitable platform with respect to sharing.
Anyone else have a perspective on that, perhaps Lene?
Thanks. I do agree with John. However, I think we do need to look at the regulatory framework for the bands that we'd be implementing this in. If we're looking at a band that is auctioned, we can ratchet, but we can only ratchet in one direction. We do need to be cautious, particularly given the FCC's policy on technology independence and technology neutrality, such that we don't accidentally cut off future options. We do need to be cautious and keep some degree of conservatism, as there is no undo button. If a federal agency were to cause harmful interference or receive harmful interference, there is no, under a new set of rules, there would be no way to walk that back. So there is still a need under our current regulatory regime for some level of conservatism.
Sam, I was wondering, maybe from your perspective, with federated wireless working in CBRS, how do you think evolving the policies as networks are being deployed might work?
Yeah, I think Rebecca kind of summarized some of the challenge pretty nicely. In the current paradigm, what we use in CBRS is where we worked really hard to try to come up with a really good model. And then we all SAS administrators got certified against this one model. And that was really it. It's hard to evolve with that kind of model. And it was just a model. It did not reflect measurements in any sense, ground truth data. So I think that the technology is definitely there to change this paradigm in a sense that, we can kind of start on the conservative side, but then based on, interference reports, or even later on, actually based on measurements from the incumbents, we can evolve. So, the certification could be, instead of just a one-shot thing where we have fixed parameters, we can actually have, kind of certify against a potentially evolving set of parameters so that we kind of can change the model as we go. So I definitely can see that this, an iterative approach would work given technology enhancements. It would have worked in CBRS, I think, just by, kind of allowing us to adjust the models based on our learnings as we've gone.
Anyone else have any perspectives on this before we move on to the next question?
I would just, follow up, I think, from what Lene pointed out on the, the conservative approach. There's no undo button in what you have. I think that speaks largely to the collaboration that needs to happen, much like you heard on the previous panel, from the beginning. So you can have that collaborative process before you develop something that is so conservative that impedes the utility of the band. So having that upfront communication is paramount to ensuring that you have the most optimal regime going forward.
Okay, thank you.
I might add one comment, Eric.
Yeah, please, Nick.
So just coming from the academic side, there's a growing number of test beds and research platforms that could enable experimentation and data collection and piloting of some of these ideas that are heavily being funded by NSF and DoD. And so, it's a matter of stitching these things together on a timeline that I think could feed into the cycle that was illustrated earlier.
Ed, just to wrap up, do you have any thoughts on that topic?
We worked very closely with the industry when we did develop the models. I would agree they were just models, and there wasn't any measured data going on with them. And I think we can learn from that. But I think they do have to be models that are somewhat vetted and understood before we can make any changes. So.
Yeah, kind of actually a perfect segue to the next question. So, one obvious way to improve predictions from feasibility studies for potential sharing between incumbent federal and other users is by identifying particular areas where improved data, including from industry, could significantly benefit the feasibility analysis. In fact, Vic Sparrow from NASA raised this point earlier today. We need good data to feed modeling assumptions, right? How do we
Right.
ensure NTIA obtains the necessary and sufficient ground truth data on technical parameters and network deployment characteristics to feed into its analyses? And maybe, Ed, you could, briefly elaborate on the challenges your group has had in the past, and then maybe the other panelists can respond.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Again, at the heart of any spectrum management decision is a sharing study that we do, and that sharing study, of course, uses different models, propagation models, interference protection criteria. That's another place where we usually get hung up early in the process of what to establish. And now recently, it's been clutter loss and how to apply clutter loss in our models. And again, we've listened to a lot of different proposals, but we've not gotten a good, solid technical support or for using any one propagation model or clutter loss model in our analysis. And it's one thing we struggle with every study we do. It's one common thing we study with. We always discuss, argue, disagree on the propagation modeling and the interference protection criteria. And you need those to do the analysis that we need to make the decision on the feasibility or sharing. So.
Yeah, so Ed and his group they're in an unenviable position. So the rest of the folks on the panel, how do we help out? How do we help them put together those feasibility studies and improve them?
I think from an industry point of view, I'll speak for T-Mobile, and just looking back at what we did in AWS3 and some of the other studies that we did. I think one, it's having the engineering community come together and acknowledge, certain assumptions that should go into the modeling, such as clutter. If you recall back in AWS3, we had probably months of debate of what clutter table to use, just to make sure that we're not being overly conservative. And that took a lot of pain, but yet, there's widely recognized through the ITU what clutter models should be used in our modeling. So I think coming together as engineers and recognizing that up front and not trying to have one entity with their thumb on the scale by being overly conservative in that approach.
In the CBRS debates, we also spent a lot of time talking about propagation modeling. We came up with one propagation model that we've used in the sharing study, and then foolishly, we thought we could solve the propagation problem in a couple months. So we put together a small subgroup of the federal and the commercial and FCC and NTI folks to review data, measure data, propose propagation models and things. And after that 3 or 4 month exercise, we were no closer to a propagation model than we were before we started. So there's just a lot of information out there. A lot of it's very specific to a certain situation, not applicable generically or generally like we're doing, I think.
Yeah, I would just add though that it was really Ed and Paul McKenna's contribution in CBRS that really kind of saved the day. Propagation modeling, interference modeling is very contentious. It's hard to it's hard to get alignment between the incumbents and the secondary users. And really NTIA is certainly recognized as the authority here. So I think we started with TR 57. I think that gave us a good point. We put that forward. I think there was a lot of agreement on that. But it really took then Ed and Paul's involvement in CBRS to break the logjam. To kind of work out all the details necessary to get to a final approach that we used as industry. So I think NTI will continue as the experts on this. So I would, whatever we can do to help fund, further research and testing, I think would be, pay great dividends in the future.
I agree.
Lene, from a DoD perspective, maybe you could share with the group some of the concerns about information sharing, right? There's obviously some restrictions on what we want to divulge regarding those systems. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. I think as several of my fellow panelists have noted, the collaboration between industry and the federal government looking at both CBRS and AWS-3 was a key factor on why those auctions were successful. And we're looking at how can we continue those collaborative efforts to have these technical conversations where industry brings their technical parameters and the federal government can bring their technical parameters. Unfortunately, depending on the type of DoD system we're talking about, we do have some restrictions on the type of data we can share. Particularly when we're talking about an operational system, a weapon system, something we would use in our national security capabilities. Sometimes the type of information that's being requested starts to reveal vulnerabilities on that equipment. How might an adversary be able to counteract our operations when we're overseas trying to accomplish a mission? So we're looking and very much actively looking at methods where we can increase our information sharing, particularly when we're talking about sensitive and classified information. As we've moved towards a shift towards studying mid-band, we are encountering more operational systems, those warfighting and weapons type systems, and we're really looking for different mechanisms on how can we create a forum where we can have those open dialogues with industry while still maintaining the security and operational impact assessments such that we're not jeopardizing our national security missions. So that information sharing is something that is very important to the department and something as we are very much actively looking at of how can we do this better.
Great, thank you. So you see data come in various forms. Some drive the assumptions used in system level simulations of sharing options between disparate systems. Other data provide insights into key performance indicators needed to derive interference thresholds for incumbent and commercial receivers. And then there are data needed to establish technical rules for the new services. So the question is the government asking for a burdensome amount of data from industry? And if so, how might we address that?
I think from a carrier perspective, I look at a lot of the information that we've given over the years for various bands, and I think industry's been very forthcoming with our technical parameters to be used in the various analysis. I think in that regard, at least from an industry point of view, I believe we are giving the appropriate amount of information that's being requested of us. And we've done that in subsequent bands as well. So if there's a shortfall there, it gets back to that collaboration and making sure that if something isn't understood, then we would definitely want our federal partners to come to us and ask us how we can clarify.
Right. The last thing we want to do is overestimate the interference on the commercial system. That doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help us and it doesn't help you.
Right.
Commercial side.
Right.
Because I mean, you're right. We have shared information. And this is a little inside baseball. The randomized reel. Most people, those who've been involved with it, don't know what the randomized reel was, and we did appreciate that information because we were able to validate one of our deployment approaches using the randomized reel. But then we've got other parameters like antenna height and transmitter power. Because I don't believe that every transmitter in the commercial deployment is operating at the maximum power. I don't believe that that's probably true. Personally, I think. And I think we may overestimate the interference when we make that assumption. But part of the problem is we have nothing else except what's in the commission service rules, the FCC service rules, to kind of lead us to what kind of parameters we should use. And typically, that's a maximum ERP level that's specified in the FCC rules. And if we can come up with some kind of distribution of power levels that are more representative, because I think if you use the maximum power everywhere, you probably cause so much self-interference in your own network that it would not be what you would be doing. But so the more information we can get in that area would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, and I think to your point on that, Ed, I think another area that should be included would be the introduction of massive MIMO and beamforming and how that is calculated in your overall analysis, because I believe in some cases that's not being assessed appropriately.
Correct. If there's an algorithm or a model or a way to estimate that included in the analysis, we would love to see it. I mean, because we've been recently with millimeter wave, we've been looking at the active antenna systems, and we don't know if we're modeling it there correctly. So anything we can do to help us get a better handle on that would be appreciated.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I would add too that, you know, I think with cloud technology, I think we've demonstrated we can do some pretty incredible things in terms of protection. What, you know, maybe wasn't possible before is possible now, or soon will be possible. So, you know, I think that kind of what we've done in CBRS is we've done some cases where we're protecting an area. So we protect all points in an area. So we don't actually need to know, you know, precisely where the incumbent receivers are located, because we can just protect to a whole area, which has benefits, you know, in providing security. But I think we can kind of flip that around as well, and we can model interference coming from an area as well. So in that sense, you know, we can protect the you know, commercial systems privacy. They don't have to reveal exact locations, and you know, they can also maybe more easily come up with an aggregate interference coming from a region, and we can take that into our protection model. So, you know, I think we maybe just need to rethink a little bit from a, you know, kind of what can be done with processing nowadays. It can change the game.
Okay. Yeah, I think of, you know, as we collect this data, and you've heard some references to Inside Baseball. So a number of folks were involved in the AWS3 rulemaking. The Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee set up 5 working groups, and within these working groups, representatives from both government and from industry shared notes on their systems. And so this randomized reel was actually kind of an anonymized laydown of one of the carrier's cell site locations. So provided the density of the cell sites without actually divulging the street address of each of them. And so that was something that OSM could use for their aggregate interference modeling. One of the other things that Ed alluded to was just having better assumptions. You know, there were models of transmit power from the LTE East. And I think what you're getting at, Ed, is would it have been more value, or would it have been a better use to have actual empirical data for UEs where we could have ground truth on that? Is that where you're alluding to in terms of getting more accurate data for your assumptions?
I mean, just more accurate data in terms of, we don't want to overestimate the interference from the commercial network. That's the last thing we want to do, but we want to do it when we want to try to accurately represent it. But yes, we had measured data. Then one of the arguments is discussions or arguments we get involved with, I guess, in terms of, does that represent AWS3? Does that represent what a 5G network would look like, yeah? So.
Yeah,
I mean,
question for you.
I'm not too sure what.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Question for you, Nick, is maybe you could share with us a little bit about Spectrum X and the role there. And question is, how do we get the academic community plugged in on this? You know, to get the necessary details out to people within academia so that they can really target their research to answer a lot of these questions.
Thanks, Eric. I'd love to expand on that a little bit. So let me say that I am co-director of the Wireless Institute at Notre Dame, but many of you may know that we just announced that Notre Dame is leading Spectrum X, which is the first NSF Spectrum Innovation Center. So NSF has been very busy and is collaborating very actively with the FCC and the NTIA to try to create a little bit better impedance match between academia and the various spectrum stakeholders. So we're very excited about this. We have been working hard as a team. We combined 4 planning grant teams, one led by Notre Dame, one led by CU Boulder, one led by the University of Virginia, and one led by Olin College. And the hope is that we can really bring some of the power of students and faculty and train a workforce to help address some of these problems. So I just want to put it out there that, you know, we've identified 6 flagship projects that we're going to pursue as we launch Spectrum X. One is in trying to think about how to focus on passive coexistence or coexistence with passive receivers for scientific use. Another one is active coexistence. We've talked about a lot of these topics today in midband and 6 gigahertz. Another is just sensing kind of broadly, developing really generic spectrum sensors that can help get some situational awareness, low cost, easily deployable, even crowdsourced sensing, kind of taking that to the next level. Another is data. So working on transforming all of this data, collecting it in the cloud and making it pretty openly accessible is another big push. The point here is that this is a different kind of NSF project. This is not your traditional, very basic research project. And we're really working hard to create a structure that allows us to interact with the agencies and with industry and the regulators to try to make a difference and try to contribute. So we're very open to collaboration and trying to be a part of this solving these problems.
Thank you. Next question, what other technical factors and data have we not considered yet that can improve spectrum sharing feasibility analyses? Anyone, have we missed something that's critical to this effort?
I don't know if we missed anything or not, but we haven't. There's areas where we still haven't reached agreement on how to employ some parameters, sort of like color loss. I think every reasonable person will agree that color loss exists and things like that. It's how much to apply and where to apply it that we get in our discussions. And we haven't reached agreement on it. Even some of the ITR models, even though they're a good starting place, they leave a little bit to the desire, I guess. They have some parameters in it that it's hard to figure out how to implement those parameters. Mm-hmm. Like one of the models has a percentage locations parameter, and nobody really knows how to define that percentage of locations in the color loss model. So but that's something we're going to continue to work on because we're convinced it needs to be in the analysis.
So Sam, you were mentioning earlier work on propagation modeling. As we go through all the different bands that are under consideration, different use cases, do you have any advice for us? How do we go about getting adoption of better models so people can agree on clutter loss?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess again, I look at NTIA as the authority on that. So I think that again, we relied on NTIA, on ITM, EHATA, in CBRS, and for NTIA to kind of break the logjam and parameters. I think that went so well that we just decided we pretty much use it for 6 gigahertz for AFC. So again, I think that when we start to look at other bands, millimeter wave, et cetera, that I just encourage us to look to NTIA to kind of lead it. We just need to do what it takes to fund whatever modeling, testing initiatives that we can to allow them to create accurate models that we can use in these shared environments. So yeah, when it comes to propagation modeling, I think it's just keep NTIA going and into new bands, and I think that's the best methodology.
Yeah, I'll agree with the rest of our panelists. Having more validated and community accepted models for propagation, and Ed hit the nail on the head. I think we've all said in way too many discussions on clutter and how do we model clutter. I think having those types of validated and accepted models before we start any future analyses just gets us so much further ahead because we can stop all those negotiations because we're all starting from a same common baseline understanding and common set of assumptions.
It occurs to me that...
Well, and also
Sorry, go ahead.
Just other inputs that could be, garnered to improve the process. And I want to pick up on something, that was mentioned earlier with respect to, Eric, you noted, empirical data. And we found many times a lot of the assumptions that go into the models, just having that empirical data to level set against what you're modeling against is, truly valuable information to really help you get the most optimal, sharing regime that you could expect. Using overly conservative parameters, it really only, it does more to protect one's interest as opposed to allowing for equitable sharing.
Yeah, one of the risks with empirical data is it could be anecdotal. How do we deal with that? Because a lot of times you'll say, well, for example, with the propagation model, to validate it, you really have to test it in a number of different topologies and use cases. For empirical data, if we wanted to look at the distribution of UE transmit power, how do we go about doing that? Obviously, prior to an auction, you don't have 2 or 3 years to do those studies. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, certainly you could do it at the busy hour, of what your use cases would look like, and I think from there, yeah, we do have the means to give you information that would help better inform the data that you're actually seeing from an empirical standpoint. And so we do a lot of capacity planning in our networks based off busy hour traffic loading, and we definitely could pull something like that into the equation if it was asked for.
Yeah. Any other perspectives on that? All right. Another question. So while efforts are underway within NTIA and the federal agencies to better characterize their systems, our data are often not granular enough or complete enough for a feasibility analysis. What are the biggest obstacles to obtaining critical data on federal systems? And are there steps we can take to provide more transparency to the commercial sector on government systems characteristics?
Well, right now, our data sources are somewhat limited for federal systems. We have the GMF, Government Master File, that's got frequency assignment type data and deployment type data. And we've also got system review or spectrum certification data, which has a little bit more detailed characteristics. We did start an effort on, we're trying to be a little more transparent with data with our spectrum.gov website, but that's very high level, not real technical. More description of what's in the systems that are in the band.
Yeah, I think maybe too, a lesson learned from CBRS is that kind of reiterating that we can easily protect to an area. So if there's reluctance on federal systems to share information because of privacy concerns, I don't think that should be an obstacle. I think that we can aggregate the information and obfuscate it in a way that allows us to ensure protection. So I think maybe that's one way forward to get more granular, more complete information. Is just to allow us to obfuscate and aggregate, and maybe even have kind of a third party collect that data to protect privacy, things like that.
Yeah, I've heard people mention, I was just kind of curious, is it just a matter of maybe starting a little bit earlier on some of these studies? I remember from the AWS3 rulemaking, the CSMAC working groups did a lot of modeling and hashing out assumptions of models. And unfortunately, it really kind of constrained the amount of time that was available to go do some ground truth measurements. And clearly I've seen over the years, the community's gotten a lot, the relationship have been built and trust is built, so that information sharing certainly goes better now. Is it just a matter of starting a little earlier, kind of looking at NTIA's 10-year plan and saying, why don't we start looking at some of these other bands now rather than waiting until they're impending?
Absolutely. I think time is always appreciated by everyone, that if you can get more time and inform the overall engineering process more in advance, I think the better for everyone involved.
I'll agree with John on that one. It's one that the more time we can put into doing the engineering up front, making sure we can make smart decisions, I think we end up with a better product and a better solution for everyone. We're not overly conservative, but we're not also overly optimistic. I think we do a good job of striking that balance. I think one of the challenges, at least looking from the federal agency perspective, is, and I hate to say it, but it's resources. If we're now being asked to study or begin study efforts on 3, 4, 5 bands at a time, that's a large ask on the federal agencies. We do have the Spectrum Pipeline Act that we can leverage to begin to receive funds to do that, but that does start to trigger some additional timelines, and in some cases is not necessarily a viable option. We can't really use Spectrum Pipeline funds to look at an unlicensed sharing scenario. That's out of bounds for that funding. So I agree starting earlier, but I think the one thing we are going to need to figure out is how do we resource both NTIA and the federal agencies to be able to go do that.
Right, because there's only so much data we have in house, and we usually have to go out and reach out to the people, the field people in the field that are actually operating the systems to get additional information and to verify the data, which is a drain on their time, I admit.
You know, one thing that's kind of a longer lead time effort, Nick and I had a discussion about several days ago. Maybe you could elaborate on it, Nick, and it's a constituency that's not at the table here, are the actual manufacturers of this commercial telecom equipment. You know, what could be done, and what are your thoughts, Nick, about trying to design those to share? And this is kind of longer lead time, more technology, built into the commercial systems. Do you have any thoughts on that and how one might foster that?
Well, these are, some wacky observations from an academic, but the first thing, just picking up on the previous conversation, one thing that I noticed about the way that the 3GPP and Wi-Fi standards bodies work is they take advantage of scale, right? They have a massive community of people that align around models before they conduct a study. And so if we can figure out ways to get a larger group of people in the discussion earlier on, as you've already alluded to, if we can bring in students and faculty in a meaningful way through appropriate coordination mechanisms, I think we might get a bigger community targeting some of these sharing problems earlier on. Agree on some models, run lots of simulations and test robustness. Maybe it doesn't have to be the perfect propagation model, but we get some sharing rules that are pretty robust to some variations in some of these assumptions. That's ultimately the right, that's from an academic point of view, a research point of view. If you get a solution that's fairly robust and not fragile to the underlying modeling assumptions, that's generally a good system design approach. The second comment that I wanted to make is that, at least my perception is that there have been opportunities, and there likely will be more opportunities, for government agencies to utilize and take advantage of these technologies that are being developed in the commercial sector. For example, it started with FirstNet, right? The public safety community is leveraging a cellular network. They had a spectrum resource and they teamed up. I think that's a big step. All this work being done with DoD around 5G. I think in that one agency focus, they can be pushing really hard on sharing mechanisms. And most likely that would have to be done in connection between the agency systems, but also with some of these telecom vendors to push and experiment to try to make sharing more possible within the mission of a given agency. I think there's some opportunities there.
Yeah, I think a technology-focused form of sharing is a better approach than having either a database like real time. If you have the ability from a technology point of view, real time to evaluate, as I mentioned earlier, the Qualcomm approach at lower 37, the look before talk, just being able to sense the environment and having that capability is, I think, is a better way to prove out sharing across the board as opposed to a database type form of sharing. And so I would hope that we continue down the path on more, visionary approaches such as what Qualcomm's putting forward and the other vendors.
I'd say you're kind of starting to see that too in CBRS, where the CBSDs, the devices are recognizing that it is their benefit to actually share measurements. So, you know, instead of relying on maybe conservative models that we need to use in lieu of measurements, that we can actually take advantage of measurements. So, you know, I think also the commercial systems are incentivized to share information, just in that it improves their own performance. It gives them more capacity and coverage. So I think that's definitely a trend that'll help things.
I would also
Oh, go ahead, John.
go ahead. I just wanted to comment on the CBRS piece. I think just you know, yes, technology is the way to go, and it's going to help everyone more from an equitable standpoint. I think the big thing when I look at a situation like CBRS, and I see or hear other folks now wanting to change some of the conditions after the band has been put together. I think when you start to change some of those conditions, you now risk disenfranchising certain elements of that model, such as the potential introduction of a higher power CPSD, that, you know, now you're changing the power flux density, if you will, at a given location that you're trying to protect DoD at the expense of the GAA providers. So I would caution against trying to change the rules midway through the game, and focus more on the technology aspects of trying to share under the current framework.
Thanks, John. I guess where I was going was I'm going to go in full agreement with everyone. I think investment in technology that helps us share spectrum machine to machine dynamically without the use of a third party is a huge way forward. And I know that's something DoD is very interested in. How can we advance spectrum sharing technologies? From our perspective, a lot of those technologies that helps DoD share better at home also provides us with strategic advantages overseas when we're conducting our operational missions. So those spectrum sharing technologies are something that the department is very, very interested in. And we're excited to hear that the commercial sector is also really starting to look in that direction.
You know, one idea that's been proposed through the Silicon Flatirons is risk-based analyses. And they make the case that those types of analyses are being adopted by regulators in other contexts. And so the question is, how would application to interference analyses for spectrum sharing feasibility studies, you know, what are the promise to reduce margins of perceived overprotection of incumbent systems? And what would it take to understand, gain confidence in, and adopt that approach?
That's a very good question. We've got we started in the early parts of it. It's going to become an education for the agencies because they typically don't look at it this way. But we were looking at things we can define risk as trying to figure out what risks there are, what can we do about the risk. By again helping divide, maybe identifying some dominant interference scenarios would help also in terms of the risk assessment. It's a move away from the worst case deterministic analysis we've used in the past, where, you know, for example, propagation, we treat it sometimes as a single value where it's really a distribution of values. So Monte Carlo with statistical, with the risk-based approach is as one direction we're going to go in. We're in the very early stages of that. I haven't really applied it to a problem yet. We've talked about it internally as a way of moving forward.
I think we also need to look at that risk-based approach going both ways, particularly with some of the recent bands of interest, and particularly looking at 3 gigahertz. DoD does have some very high-powered radars in that band. And it's one of them of we're not just looking at, when we set our service rules, it's not just protecting DoD operations. Part of it's also making sure that we from a DoD perspective aren't causing undue interference to commercial operations, or at least commercial operations are aware of where they will be receiving interference from DoD. So when we start talking about that risk-based, if we're looking at some really high-powered systems, of which DoD does have quite a number, we are also looking kind of both ways.
Yeah, I might add, I think I think that we kind of have a tendency to maybe apply a single methodology to all cases of protection without really kind of thinking through the consequences of interference. So, you know, I think that there's some applications, some types of receivers where interference maybe isn't that big of an issue. There aren't really significant consequences. You know, if you're doing streaming video, or, you know, or you have the ability to retransmit, you know, and you have significant latency abilities, maybe interference isn't so catastrophic. Whereas, you know, if we're talking about a radar system, just a single interference event might be catastrophic. So, you know, I really think it's important to do this risk-based, consequence-based considerations. And, you know, again, I would think NTIA is kind of the best place to do this, because that's, you know, it gets very subjective. Of course, you're going to have all kinds of arguments between the, you know, the protectors and the ones causing the interference as to what is suitable to define consequences. But it should be considered, sure.
Yeah.
You know, I also think in the context of, you know, when we talk about, you know, shared access, and if it's, let's call it licensed shared access. So when you do a licensed shared access, that's something like, take CBRS as a POW. You're expecting a level of service based on, you know, the license that you have. And so I think the risk base has to take that into equation as well, right? You got to, if you're going to be doing some sort of sharing, if you're licensing the spectrum and you're paying a premium for that license, then that should be taken into consideration as well when you're assessing risk.
Right.
Just a quick observation. It seems like there's that much more information about systems that needs to be developed and shared in order to, you know, come up with cost functions that you can use to assess risk. Distribution,
That's true.
costs.
Yep.
It really, I mean, you know, there's frameworks for this, but it does require a lot more detailed information about the pairs, you know, the transmitters causing interference, the receivers subject to interference. So the complexity of that is going to grow pretty substantially.
And I think
Right.
when we
And it's
start
probably
talking,
going to
go ahead, Ed.
Go ahead. I was going to say, it probably will also require us talking to people outside the spectrum management community. I mean, because this is not something they may be able to answer or identify as far as risk or risk mitigation.
Yeah, to amplify on what Ed was saying, I think once we move towards risk, we start talking about not only the technical risk of receiving interference, but what's the impact of that interference, which means we start getting into, from a federal agency perspective, we start talking about the impacts to our missions and capabilities. And that's, as Ed alluded to, that brings in a whole different community of folks outside of the standard spectrum management community, because what may appear to be inconsequential to some or to outsiders, I will say I'll look at it and say, from a DoD perspective, it's all about meeting our commander's intent. And it's one of them it's the making sure we understand what that is and what the impact to federal agency missions and operations are, to make sure we're not jeopardizing those if we move towards this risk-based piece. So it increases the calculus quite a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So let's take some questions from the audience. First one I have here from Greg Wagner. How do techniques applied in higher level portions of the OSI stack, network layer, for example, affect or afflict our ability to characterize and ultimately reach consensus on interference protection criteria for spectrum sharing? Do the existence of these techniques argue for or against the iterative approach described previously?
Well, I'll take a shot at that one. I think first and foremost, you know, there's interference and then there's harmful interference, and how you define interference. I think I'll put it. You can have interference where you lose the physical layer altogether, where now you've just disrupted the communication link, and now you've got an issue from that standpoint. But then there's also an interference where it could impact your throughput capability. the amount of bits that you can carry over that link and how you're trying to overcome that interference. So I think you have to look at it in those contexts of, interference versus harmful interference, and how do you incorporate that risk into any type of sharing regime you're trying to deploy.
Yeah, I agree. You have to look at it at the service quality level. So at the physical layer, things might look very bad, but you might have the ability to do retransmissions. The application may have some air concealment, things like that in place. So I really think you have to consider all layers when you make the evaluation to figure out the consequences of the interference and whether it's bad or not.
I don't know if this was part of the question, but the ability to aggregate spectrum across bands, a licensed band, a lightly licensed band, and even an unlicensed band, that allows a certain amount of resilience to some forms of interference and other congestion in these links. But again, it just makes for a much more complicated analysis. And collecting data, reporting on, evaluating system performance, designing the system to take advantage of those aggregated links becomes very intricate.
All right, let's move on to another question here. This one from Andres Rosa. Question is, we've been hearing a lot about spectrum efficiency. How is it addressed when services measure efficiency differently? How do we tackle that when the definition of spectrum efficiency is kind of a moving target?
I was going to say, I think we've been having discussions and arguments on how do we define spectrum efficiency for decades now. Ed, I'm looking to you. How long have we been having that conversation?
I mean, what's the spectrum efficiency of a radar?
Well, we're actually talking about that in terms of some of the work we're doing with ITS right now, I believe.
Could you elaborate on it?
Yeah, and I think part of it really comes down to what's the definition, because federal agencies and commercial entities access spectrum for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fundamentally, commercial entities are trying to provide a service, and for most companies, trying to maximize the amount of revenue they generate. And as a service provider, or as someone who uses your service, I'm very thankful that you provide me with a great quality of service. However, as a federal agency, we're not about how many users do we service or how much revenue do we generate. It's all about meeting our missions. So we kind of have a fundamental disconnect on why folks access spectrum. And I think that's been, and Ed, I'll let you correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's kind of been one of the things at the heart of that ongoing dialogue of how do you define spectrum efficiency, because we each look at the world very differently.
Thank you. So this is a question from Dennis Roberson, and he asks, how do we think that NTIA and specifically ITS, so I guess the moderator's getting roped into this one, might be able to work with the new NSF Spectrum X Center? Why don't you kick that off, Nick? How might ITS work with you? And I certainly can elaborate on that.
Well, this sort of collaboration, I think, will be occurring at several levels. So first of all, before they formed the Spectrum X Center, NSF established a memorandum of agreement with the NTIA and the FCC. So NSF is coordinating and making sure that the research is trying to make sure that the research is being conducted by the Spectrum Innovation Centers will be relevant and useful to the broader, spectrum ecosystem. So that's one piece. Second piece is that as part of that, NSF is forming a government working group. And so that government working group will be meeting with the Spectrum X leadership on a fairly regular basis. I presume, although I haven't heard the details yet, but I presume that NTIA and FCC will be invited to participate actively in that government working group. So it'll be along the lines of high-level planning, road mapping. We'll be presenting some of our thoughts on how to move forward and getting feedback and adjusting plans and so on. The third layer, if you will, is that SpectrumX is going to be creating an external advisory board, again, primarily to help situate ourselves and steer us in good directions. But FCC and NTI will have a seat on that board each, if they so desire. And then the fourth level is, things like situations like this. And we've got active conversations going with various groups in ITS, trying to establish CRADAs. Several of the universities already have CRADAs, the universities within SpectrumX. The idea being that rather than duplicating efforts and working in sort of, along separate lines, we try to collaborate and align our roadmaps so that we can do things that add up to something more substantial than what any one of us can do on our own. If you want to take it from there, Eric, I hope I haven't set you up or surprised you in any way.
Nope, I would mention as well, and Evelyn Romali mentioned this morning, that in the president's budget is essentially an initiative for the Federal Advanced Communications Test Site. So should the budget pass, that would bring in funding to support work out at our Table Mountain Radio Quiet Zone that's north of Boulder. So our vision for that is actually to kind of leverage leverage and expand work that we're presently doing with DoD to look at interactions between DoD radars and 5G. And the idea would be to expand it beyond those particular focus systems to not just 5G, but 6G. And, one of the kind of the catchphrases that we used was to get all of these communities together. We always work in close consultation with our Office of Spectrum Management. You have to understand, if you're going to research something, it needs to be something that can pass regulatory muster. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you have reached out. You want to make sure the industry is involved, the actual network operators. But in this case, this work is involving the actual OEMs that are manufacturing the equipment. And really, the holy grail is what we call designing to share, is getting out in front, getting involved in the standards so that the actual equipment that comes from the OEMs has options, has features that would allow you to potentially pay for a particular license of enable features, making those systems more robust and less susceptible to interference from government systems. So we're really excited about the potential for that program, and should it be funded, that's something that definitely will be having a number of kickoff sessions, and probably would try to get plugged into some of the work that your team is doing, Nick. Any thoughts on that from the rest of the panelists?
From a department perspective, we're excited to see what comes out of SpectrumX. Sounds like a great program. You guys are headed in a great direction, and we're very much looking forward to see what comes out.
Thank you. I might also stress that another key feature of what NSF is trying to do is enable education and workforce development efforts at a coordinated scale that I've never seen before. I've been on the faculty for 20 years, and we've done career awards and small grants. We've done little course modules and the like, but this is an entire revamp of the curriculum around Spectrum, and I think creating a workforce that you all need, regardless of who you work for today, you probably need some help. And if we can help shape that workforce together, that will be really exciting and transformative going forward.
All right, so we've kind of alluded to this, but I thought maybe we could elaborate a little bit more. Earlier discussions, there was talk about key technical lessons that were learned in both AWS3 and CBRS. How can we leverage all that knowledge gained and lessons learned going forward for the next spectrum sharing proceeding?
Well, I think, just Sam, alluded to it. You look to NTIA as the federal regulator of spectrum, really helping, harness all those lessons learned and collectively maybe pull together the groups again to talk about how you can leverage those capabilities in future bands. And I think that that's something that industry would be more than happy to be engaged in that process, as I'm sure academia would be as well.
Right.
Yeah, I would add too. I think one exciting thing is sharing works. I think we've demonstrated in CBRS AWS3, that it definitely works. We're getting few, if any, reports of interference. If anything, I think what we've demonstrated is maybe we're too conservative in our incumbent protection algorithms. Maybe we can't trust some tests and measurements that we've gathered. There were early studies on, the impact of LTE on spin 43 that suggested, that devices could operate pretty close to radar systems and not cause harmful interference. So, I think going forward, maybe we now know that sharing works, and we could put a little bit more trust and leverage more some of the tests that have been done on interference modeling.
I think several of other panelists. Go ahead, Ed.
No, I was just going to talk about maybe it definitely be a good idea to have a feedback loop or some way to go back and review to make changes to the text as we see things at work to incorporate those more. Yeah.
What I was going to say is I think several of our panelists have alluded to this previously. The level of collaboration we had between industry and the federal government for both AWS3 and CBRS was tremendous. We've done a lot to foster the trust in the relationships between the organizations, and I think we need to continue to leverage that moving forward. We've done a lot of excellent groundwork, and let's keep moving forward and keep moving forward together.
Yeah, so my colleague from ITS, Mike Cotton, is going to be speaking to this topic here shortly, but thought maybe you could share your perspectives on this. So new spectrum sharing feasibility studies require us to tailor and fine-tune both propagation and aggregate interference models. Consensus on these models would no doubt expedite decision-making and result in better engineered rules. So could you give Mike some advice? How do we gain consensus on propagation models? Is it really easy, or what's it going to take?
We found it to be hard so far. It seems, like I said, it's one of those kind of things we always talk about and discuss and a lot of times disagree with on every study. What propagation model, because there's a number of them out there, international ones and domestic ones. Ones that are used for interference prediction, ones that are used for designing networks. They're just try to use the right tool for the right propagation model for the right problem is probably important.
I think looking at the theme kind of as we've kind of had on that collaboration, as Mike moves forward with his program, let's bring together all the stakeholders as part of that development process, such that we can have those arguments at the beginning of the process, not once there's a final product. And that way, if there's disagreement on how things are being done, you can adjust midstream. I think just the collaboration and having all the key parties involved and having a seat at the table, hopefully will help develop a final product that everyone has confidence in.
Right. Key is to be as transparent as possible. In the process. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add in safeguard against being overly conservative. Understand the risks going in, try to manage those risks for a balanced approach on selecting whatever model you come out with.
Right.
Yeah. And not to make Mike's job, which is very difficult to begin with, but to make it even more complicated, I think it's really important to help us get consensus on what model to use to kind of nail down all of the input parameters and things like that. For example, you can say, I want you to, we should use ITM, but underneath ITM are, also 20 plus different assumptions. So, the more that, that you can help us also understand the parameters to use with the models that you're proposing, the better. That'll help us more quickly make use of these models that are put forward.
You're absolutely right there. And when you pick ITM, there are definitely a series of parameters you got to select that affect the results as much as anything. So trying to reach agreement on those parameters has been a challenge in some cases.
Yeah, and you're looked to as the authority. So any, when you put forward a recommendation on parameters, it's, that's taken as what we should be using.
Okay, so this will be the final question before we wrap up here from Michael Calabrese. To add in all, what is the process for moving ahead with the development of the IIC, the Incumbent Informed Capability? And conceptually, does NTIA view one purpose as informing FCC certified databases, such as the SAS used to protect Navy radar in CBRS? Maybe you kick that one off, Ed. So what is the process for moving forward with the development of IIC?
Well, right now we are working on that. I mean, we are definitely working on that. I mean, there's going to be, there is some buy-in that we have to get from all the parties, but we are working that issue very hard.
Yeah, I think the big one on IIC, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ed.
No, go ahead.
No, I think that I guess from an industry point of view, certainly it sounds intriguing and something that we'd want to know more about. I would say that, a technology-based approach would be the best approach, at least in my mind. I think if you're talking sharing, let's focus on technology and kind of take the human element out of this. I would need to understand a lot of the detail going into the informed incumbent capability and how if there's a human element associated with that, how conservative is that approach and what is that going to have on the folks that are looking for equitable spectrum access?
Right.
With the ESC, I believe you get that with CBRS today. It's a sensing capability, and it's pointing out exactly what is there and who or what other entities can gain access to the spectrum. If it's an IAC capability and it's an individual spectrum manager making that decision, I'd want to understand a lot more about that and how that could potentially, thwart, spectrum access in some cases.
I'll agree with John. I think everyone having a firm understanding of what IIC is, how IIC would operate, and the intended function of IIC would I think be the next step of its kind of, we understand this as a concept. Well, where is it going? Just really understanding what is this tool, how would it operate, its intended purposes. I think that would be a huge next step to moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, it's our step, of course, of using the time domain function of spectrum management. I mean, which we've done geography and frequency, but time is something we haven't been able to extract up until now. The ESC is part of that, using time-based, and so is the IIC. So, like anything new, it's going to take some time to go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ed. Finish up.
No, I was going to say, like any other new concept, it's going to take time for people to become comfortable with it on all sides, commercial side and the federal side.
So I just want to say as we wrap up, I want to thank all of you, John, Ed, Lene, Nick, Sam. Thank you for your insights, the dialogue. I just want to say to the audience, this is just kind of a sampling of the kind of discussion that happens at ISART. If we're able to meet in person, even more so, there's breakout sessions where people are networking in the hallways. It's a fabulous event, and just also invite people if you've got some views and you think you've got some solid research and some ideas and you want to be a panelist at ISART, don't forget to keep your eye out for the call for papers. And look forward to that event coming up in spring of 2022. Thank you all. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Charles.
Thank you, Eric. And that wraps up panel number 3. Kind of getting more into the details with this one. I think Lene from Department of Defense kind of hit it off perfectly when when underscoring the importance of understanding the modeling. With it's kind of hard to put things back in the box. So there's no quick undo button on this. So you got to get it right. And likewise, John, on kind of on the other side, saying that you have to kind of balance it, and especially with the conservative analysis has to be done. But nevertheless, there's quite a bit of risk that would have to be considered here. And then Ed discussing the propagation modeling and how a large part of it, especially with dealing with the clutters, the clutter databases tends to be band specific, and there needs to be a way to kind of expand it and leverage that up into other bands as well. And then kind of Sam as well, kind of hitting again on the contentious issues of a lot of these issues. I sort of kid, you get a few RF spectrum engineers in a room and talk about what type of attenuation values to have for clutter values. You'll be there for a long time. And then really appreciated Nick homing in on the NSF Spectrum and Innovation Initiative, and in particular the recent grant to Spectrum X, and really looking forward to the activities coming from that. So a great third panel. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Cotton, who is chief of the Telecommunications Theory Division at ITS, and he'll be providing a presentation on standardizing mid-band propagation models.
Thank you, Charles. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to present on standardized mid-band propagation models. As the panel discussed and as Rebecca mentioned, the ISARC call for papers, in the ISARC call for papers, we want to continue to advance spectrum management and inform spectrum policy decisions based on improved science, data, and technology. And propagation, as was mentioned in the panel, is an important part of that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for a little bit of background, ITS has a leadership role at ITUR Study Group 3 on radio wave propagation, where we lead the processes on technical inputs, negotiations, and drafting groups. ITS also has significant influence on a lot of the national discussions that happen, for example, in these NTI-led interagency feasibility studies that were discussed. Also, like what Sam was talking about in the industry government spectrum sharing technology developments, we had a big role in certification of the spectrum access systems and the propagation models that underlie. And then also we work with interagency groups on spectrum sharing technology developments. For instance, the AWS3 portal and the models that underlie that. So ITS really is a natural leader in this space, I think, given our long-standing dedicated focus on propagation theory and measurement, and as well as our sort of accepted objectivity in as the regulatory lab. So interference analysis, as we've talked, is really a primary use case for our propagation models, and it drives a lot of our requirements. So on the illustration on the right, this is a common interference analysis where we are estimating aggregate emissions from, for example, a wireless network in and around population density, propagating over the horizon and into incumbent receivers, such as Navy receivers out to sea. So, the geometric diagram here is basically a model set up to predict troposcatter propagation mechanisms from first principles. And, I don't have to go into any further detail. I think we heard from the panel that clutter modeling is a difficult problem and we need to move forward with that. Really that's one thing where the cluttered environment, just like the little picture of the urban environment, it's not symmetric and it's not ideal. And so a lot of the modeling that happens there is empirical. And so there's going to be there's a real need for more and more data, measured data to feed these clutter models. And then also there's additional data. It's not just measured propagation data, but we're making some serious advances in using data like LiDAR data to set a foundation for a lot of our propagation models. So if I pause here just to make a quick announcement on a couple NTI publications that are coming forth here soon. One publication is on Troublescatter Theory. I think we'll get that out by the turn of the calendar year. We've learned that the work done in Troublescatter really didn't all get published, and when we work towards deriving these concepts from first principles, a lot of it was missing in the literature. And so I think that this publication that's coming out from Dr. Roger Dahlke will be a nice contribution in this space. And then second, there's another publication coming out on processing LiDAR data toward clutter prediction and analysis, clutter propagation prediction and analysis. And again, I think it's a good step towards advances in this space and really improving our models. And one other thing on this slide I'd like to mention is that really one requirement from these interference analyses is that these propagation is not deterministic nor stationary. And so these models, a requirement is that they need to provide probability distributions of these losses. It can't just be a number or statistics. It needs to be either the median and variance, for example, of this probability space. So this kind of showcases the multidisciplinary and diverse problems that we're trying to solve, and it requires skill sets in physics and mathematics, meteorology, measurement science, data science, and computer science. And I think in the past, those skill sets haven't been fully leveraged. So I take you back a few years, maybe behind the curtain at ITS, about 5 years ago. So we have this irregular train model, which is a cornerstone to a lot of our propagation predictions. And about 5 years ago, we did an inventory across NTIA about ITM to inquire who has an ITM implementation on their desktop. And we found upwards of 7 or 8 implementations, and we put them to the test. We ran them through a full comprehensive set of input parameters, and we looked at the results, and we kind of realized that we really need to converge on a single implementation of ITM in order to evolve it and advance it. And basically, what we learned from that exercise is that silos within an organization or across organizations really can be a hindrance to progress. And so since that time, our real overarching philosophy is to make a collective effort to build consensus by developing authoritative and trustworthy models in an open and collaborative way. The inner circle, this diagram on the right, the inner circle represents the scientific process that we cycle through on a priority basis. It involves measurement validation, rigorous peer review, regression testing. We require that significant changes to the models be accompanied by publication or some form of documentation. Minor changes could just be a document accompanying the code. But the output of this process is a software product. And we push, as indicated by that blue box on the right, and we push updates to ITS propagation codes that are managed on the NTI GitHub site with the URL provided at the top. So once those codes reach some maturity, we release them to public so that the public can basically integrate those into their own use case applications. And so, within this process, our overarching philosophy, we are having success in breaking down the silos within our organization, and making progress here, and we're moving forward to extend this process to the external community as depicted by the outer red circle. So yeah, these next two slides are to kind of have some focus on the software engineering part of propagation, because I think that we've made some very serious progress on this in the last couple of years. I think when CBRS came around, we threw a Fortran version over the fence that I don't even know what the date on that was, but we kind of learned that we need to take a more modern approach to the software products that we put out. So one thing that we are working toward is a unified code base that we publish in C++, and that forms a kernel for the codes that we use. We take that kernel and we put wrappers around it to expose the functionality of those codes to other languages like MATLAB and Python. And so what that provides is reproducible results across languages and platforms. And we've also worked to ensure software integrity with code signing and data packaging. So specifically, the DLLs and the executables are digitally signed by ITS before public release. And that basically gives assurance to the users that the codes and the executables come directly from ITS and they're not tampered with. And in the reverse direction, when we're working with users on these codes, we have confidence that the packages that they're using are official builds that came directly from us. So there's good efficiencies there. So since the stand-up of this of PropLib, we've had a lot of engagement from government, industry, and academia. There's an ITU model called P528 that predicts air-to-ground propagation. That implementation that we offer on our GitHub site is an integral part to the ITU recommendation. And in fact, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, is using that as part of their toolkit, and requests for improvements are ongoing. And this slide offers up a picture of the codes that we've offered at various levels of maturity in our pipeline. There are 4 codes that we offer for public release, including ITM, EHATA, P528, and the low frequency, medium frequency smooth earth. And there are half a dozen models that were offered in internal production. So what we do is we have a development environment that's basically single developers working on their codes. Once it gets to a stable development stage, we open those codes up to NTIA, and so we offer it up to the propagation focus group at ITS and to OSM for usage, and that basically creates the opportunity to test these codes and to see how usable they are. And once we get to them to some level of maturity, we open those up to public release. And in full transparency, the prop library that we're offering up is supported by a single computer engineer, Billy Kozma. And we're really happy with progress, but really we need to do things in a much bigger way. We need to build out this team in order to support this and take full advantage of what we're calling PropLib. So this leads me to the new initiative that was mentioned briefly in the panel that I'm happy to describe here further. Starting yesterday, actually, we are starting this new 5-year program funded by DSO, Defense Spectrum Organization, to establish a state-of-the-art propagation model framework to predict loss in a diverse range of link geometries. So the focus here will be 3100 to 4200 megahertz. In the first year will be focused on planning, analyses, measurements, baselines, and program design. In future years, we're really looking forward to extending ITS's measurement portfolio in this space. We aim to bring back troposcatter measurements to validate some of the models that we've ironed out in terms of the theory in the upcoming publication. And we're going to leverage a lot of the developments that happened under ITS spectrum monitoring, under the ITS spectrum monitoring program, which really work towards creating a reliable measurement system that operates over time. So we'll be able to characterize kind of longer term trends and variabilities of these propagation mechanisms. The other thing that I think is a contribution from SpecMon is that we did a lot of data strategy development. And so I think that we've created some nice foundational work there that can be leveraged that will help us scale out in terms of our data management and usage and reuse. This is really, it's an exciting initiative for the ITS propagation team, which should allow us to do propagation R&D in a bigger way. And specifically, we are going to expand our existing outreach to support broader PropLib standardization efforts. So one planned means to expand outreach is to establish a red team of propagation experts from government, industry, and academia to help out with this initiative. The purpose of that red team will be to debate model developments and priorities and approaches, review measurement plans and results, provide critical review of modeling progress, develop PropLib use cases and end user applications. And really a primary goal here is to work with partners so that partners can contribute in-kind and complementary theory data approaches whenever they're available. Oh, hold on. Sorry, my computer went to sleep. There we go. So another thing that we're going to try to stand up to, maybe a little bit more infrequently, is a stakeholders group where we where we provide updates and information on this initiative to the community via webinars and meetings at events and things like that. And there's also we'll be looking to do an RFI to get just general feedback on certain topics from the community as well. So, in closing, we're really excited about this initiative and we're taking it very seriously. The goal is not to raise the flag of a 60-plus-year-old propagation tool like ITM, but to and call it good, right? We want to really focus in on this frequency band and take an inventory of the models that are available, do a gap analysis, and really develop a modern framework for prediction to get to more accurate results in a more general way, across a wider range of propagation paths. We'll certainly pull from methods and models from historically proven tools, but we have a lot of modern computational, informational, algorithmic techniques to improve the resolution and the accuracy and the speed and the interface of our propagation models. So I'm really, in my opinion, this is really a new day for propagation modeling, and I encourage those interested in this initiative to touch base with our propagation model GitHub site. You'll need a GitHub account, but one thing you can do there is just watch the models. So whenever updates are coming around, you'll get an email giving you some notice of that. Download the models, work to integrate those into your tools and end user applications. And if you want to jump in and really work on the front lines with us on this stuff in terms of measurements and theory and prioritizing our approaches, shoot me. And Billy Kozma is going to be the program leader. here and kind of throw your hat in as a person that's or an organization that wants to participate in the red team. And please watch out for stakeholder announcements. I think that we'll have made some really nice progress by the time ISART in the spring comes around. So I suggest we'll have a pretty strong presence there at that conference and drive a lot of the discussions there. So in that, I basically, I hope everybody stays healthy until springtime. We see you in ISART. And Charles, I don't know if I ended a little bit early, but it's back to you.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, it's certainly an excellent talk. And furthermore, I think it embodies as well the Biden administration's mandate for scientific integrity as well, with approaching this from the rigorous scientific perspective. So appreciate all the great work ITS is doing, and I'm sure we'll be having many more conversations here on out. So with that, we've reached, unfortunately, the end of the NTIA's 4th Annual Spectrum Policy Symposium. Today, we've heard what's driving American spectrum policy thinking from industry, from the administration, from federal agencies, from Congress, and the 2 spectrum regulators, us and the FCC. And this is bringing together many different spectrum policy stakeholders and experts that helped us understand the challenges and opportunities in developing a robust U.S. spectrum strategy for 21st century global leadership. Some themes we heard in today's sessions, well, we were just talking over lunchtime about all the possible action items we have from this. So we're gonna be taking that, and there, I suspect it's going to be quite a lengthy list with a lot of good ones as well. But kind of some of the overall themes I think we've heard is the partnership, between us and the FCC on a unified spectrum and telecommunications policy. Maybe everything from updating the FCC NTA current MOU to looking at a policy and strategy framework as well. I do want to highlight as well, just in the very near future, we're going to have that auction for 3.45. So we've had the Department of Defense, NTIA, and FCC working very closely to prepare for this successful auction. So that's partnership is one theme. I would say another theme deals, of course, with sharing. We heard that quite a bit in terms of spectrum sharing, dynamic spectrum sharing, and other technologies like the incumbent informing capability for NTIA's unfunded concept. But they're exciting mechanisms here that need to be explored. CBRS was certainly a big on the federal side, big introduction to that, which we look forward to expanding on. And then I think our last theme that at least I've heard was the congressional focus, and it's also the recognition of the importance of spectrum policy. Congress has keyed in on that. Representative Doyle discussed the importance of ensuring that agencies are at the table early and often to collaborate with the NTIA and FCC in spectrum work. So partnership, sharing, and congressional focus. Those are, I think, the 3 big themes we heard in today's session. But nevertheless, I think modernizing U.S. spectrum policies requires the policymakers to listen in to the many diverse views on how to best prepare the U.S. for continued global competitiveness and government excellence. I hope all of you have enjoyed watching this podcast now, and of course, it'll be recorded as well. And this, again, is our 4th annual Spectrum Policy. We hope today's conversation has informed your thinking on technology development, spectrum use, and sharing, and the priorities that the nation must balance in formulating a comprehensive strategic roadmap. Also, I would like to give a special, fantastic shout out to our NTIA Office of Spectrum Management team that pulled off this event this year. They were all contained within one of our divisions called the Spectrum Affairs and Information Division, and that includes John Alden, Eric Rosenberg, and Antonio Richardson, all under the direction of Derek Copeland. Thank you so much. Appreciate all the hard work in pulling this off. But before I conclude, I'd like to take a moment again to thank all of our keynote speakers, presenters, and panelists, as well as those of you who are joining us today on the webcast. We look forward to working with all of you as we embrace the opportunities and challenges to come. Thank you.